My name is Conn Nicoll, and as Justin mentioned, I'm part of the TELUS National Security Solutions team. And I'm going to be talking to you about incident preparedness, incident response. Very excited to be giving this talk. One of the cool things about the role I'm in is I get to work with organizations large and small across all sorts of different organizational sizes. And no surprise to this audience, the number of threats, incidents that are coming down at us is certainly not diminished. And the importance, therefore, of how you respond to those incidents is more critical than ever. And yet, what I've noticed in either formal engagements or informal conversations is that, to use, I guess, one of my consulting terms, incident response is an emerging capability for many organizations. It's something that many organizations in Canada are still trying to figure out. So working with Justin and the rest of the ISACA team, we thought, okay, well, why don't we talk about some of the best practices that we've seen in preparation, and that's where most of my talk's going to focus, during an actual incident and after, and see if we can't strike up a bit of a conversation. There's some amazing, talented folks in this audience that have great experience around incident response. So I'm going to talk about 25 to 30 minutes. We'll have some probably 10 to 15 minutes for conversation, and I would encourage and challenge everybody who's got a point of view on incident response to voice it and share it, because as an organization, I guess as a community, we'll get better by talking more about this important topic. So what I want to do, just to try and bring this to life a little more, is, if you'll indulge me, we're going to talk about a scenario. So it's fictitious, but we've tried to remove the names to protect the innocent or guilty, depending on your point of view. And we're going to go through a little bit of a story. So imagine you've got an IT team member that, for a variety of reasons, just isn't working out. Whole bunch of different great reasons, and you've decided that they are probably best served seeking employment elsewhere. And while they don't necessarily agree with your point of view, nonetheless you part ways. 4 months ago, 4 weeks ago, unbeknownst to you, that individual was able to get into your network, and in the process was able to get access to some interesting and juicy things. So they were able to, yesterday, get in and encrypt one of your servers on one of your key applications. They were able to encrypt a couple of laptops on your executive team. And just for fun, they released some customer information into the web. It's this morning, and you get a phone call on your cell phone from your IT lead, letting you know about this joyous event. And no sooner do you hang up with that team member than you get another phone call, and guess who that's from? Your CEO. What do you do? What do you do, right? So it's this kind of a scenario that you start to ask yourself questions. Are you prepared? Who is actually going to be investigating that incident from a technical perspective? And most people go, oh yeah, I got that, no problem. What about the internal communications? Who's going to handle the slings and arrows coming from the executive team? What about HR and legal? This is an HR issue for sure, and because information is now in the public domain, it's possibly a legal activity as well. So who is your contact inside of legal? And then perhaps, as important as all that, how are you collecting information as you go through this incident such that if this goes to court, that information, that evidence is now maintained so that you can use it? Right, so those are some of the things that come up as we talk to each other about incident response, as we talk with our clients. These are the things that have come up, and it's coming up more and more often. So if that's not important enough to consider in terms of why incident response should be on your list of to-dos to think through, we would suggest that some of the information that's come out from a recent study from Veracode is another. So the information, basically the study said, okay, let's go talk to the board. And for those of you who caught Robert Martin's presentation this morning, did a wonderful job talking about AHS's experience around incident response. He had that picture of 12 angry men. I thought that was fantastic. The board is looking very squarely at the normal suspects, right? So the CISO, the CIO, but they're also more and more looking at the CEO as that one-stop point of accountability around what is their organization doing around incident response to a breach. And I'd suggest, and we've talked about this with our own CISO a number of times, that change happened a couple years ago, right? Where the board said, boards around North America, if not the world, have said, okay, this is a serious business. They looked at the target scenario, and of course, everybody's heard the target story. CIO released, CEO released, not probably 2 or 3 months later, and then the board was left facing all of the drama. right? From extended stakeholders and shareholders and all that sort of stuff. So our own organization, our board, when they truly started to understand what happened with Target, got very, very crisp on communication with the executive team about the importance of cybersecurity and incident response. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with an executive team, a CEO in particular, who will typically want you to say the following: make sure that we're not in the papers, right? Make sure you're secure. Unfortunately, I've heard that direction a few times from clients, right? Where it's just make sure that we're secure. We're secure, right? And so the challenge that we have is that it's a career-limiting move in many ways not to have a good IR program, and yet the executive teams for some organizations are still struggling to figure out what good looks like and what level of involvement they should have. So when we started to think about some parallels as to what does good look like when it comes to, say, emergency response, we thought about another area of discipline, and that's firefighting, or fire drills, as the case may be. So the cool thing about a fire drill is that when that sound happens, everybody kind of knows what to do, right? We pretty much know that we should look around, and after you decide it's actually real, you get up and you walk towards a well-marked sign. Typically, your real estate team has done a good job about flagging the exits. You also know that you're supposed to walk, not push your neighbor and run over them, right? You know you're supposed to go down the stairs, and you also know when you get to the bottom of the stairs that you should probably muster, right? You should go to a place of congregation. And if you have a problem, you look to the person with the stylish red hat, and they can typically answer your questions. And more importantly, you know by pulling that little lever, all of that stuff happens automatically. The mechanisms of the fire drill, of fire response, happen automatically. And your executive team typically is engaged. So just by a show of hands, how many people have been involved with a fire drill in the last 2 years? Great. How many people have actually been in a fire in the last year? A couple. How about the last 2 years? Same couple. Okay. So what's interesting is that it's a relatively rare circumstance for it to actually have a fire in a place of work. And yet we spend that time going through and drilling on it, thinking about it, measuring it, right? Now, I don't want to have a show of hands in this one. Number of times a security incident happened. So Ponemon did a study, 2014 data. There's lots of studies in security, as we all know. And they said about 43% of the organizations that they surveyed, enterprise organizations, had a serious security incident. And yet, how many of those organizations actually did incident response? How many of us have actually done a fire drill around incident response for IT security? Not many, would be my guess. So our suggestion is that when you're dealing with executive teams, that you think about using the fire drill as a parallel, as a corollary, in terms of, look, the amount of time that we invest in terms of fire drilling, maybe we should think about investing some portion of that same amount of time into incident response. So I'll leave it there on that. I want to talk a little bit about incident response and incident management, and you have to forgive me. I'm going to read because this is a little bit dry, but I think let's just level set on what the heck it is we're talking about. It's taking a look at preparing for, identifying an incident, actually something's going wrong, and then responding and remediating that. Typically, it's done by a dedicated response team, and that response team, certainly IT is part and parcel, but it's an extended team for sure. And there's the 5 stages of grief, the 5 stages of incident management, right, which go along in terms of you actually are preparing for it, you've detected it, you contained it, you remediated or repaired, and then lastly, you hopefully learned from it and gotten better as a result. But what's an incident? Any number of things would fall under the heading of incident, some fairly benign, some not so much. If you take a look at stolen funds, so who read the announcement on the Boeing supplier that came out in the last 48 hours? Okay, so it goes something like this. Boeing supplier FACC, and keep me honest, Michael Argast, wherever you are, there you are, I see you, they're a publicly traded Australian organization. 2 days ago, $55 million was stolen. It was a hack, right? So if that's not bad enough, the press release comes out and the stock goes down 17%. So now the organization, not only are they suffering all the things that go along with losing $55 million, they're also going through the process of trying to reassure their stakeholders that they actually know what they're doing in terms of securing information. So stolen funds is a big deal. Ransomware, everybody's heard about ransomware, I would hope, right? So an encrypted hard drive, an encrypted server, all part of an incident, a lost laptop, which may be benign, but when you think about whose laptop that is and what information could be on it, perhaps not so benign. Those are all the things that we would, and more, go into an incident. And what's causing those things? Well, it is the, as I mentioned, ransomware, malware. It's also mistakes, right? We live in a complex world. IT organizations are incredibly complex, the IT environment we live in. And there's mistakes, and there's just bad actors, people that work for you that probably shouldn't, right? They're out doing something nefarious, right? So being aware that those are some of the triggers for incidents. Okay. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about preparation, and I'm going to use that in 4 different parts. So preparation, you take a look at the team that you've got behind the incident response. Take a look at the assets, so the things you want to protect. There's been some great conversation already around risk, so looking at assets from that perspective. The resources you use to do the incident response, and then lastly, your testing or your fire drill, if you will. So we'll dive in. It's been said that like most IT type disciplines, it's a people, process, and technology exercise, but the order of that is super critical. When you start to think about incident response, it's the people that really matter, right? And so as a result, think through who's on your team. Now, what you're going to see here in terms of the different titles, those are informal titles for the most part, but the roles are super critical. And while that may be a bit more than most organizations would think to start with, each role is pretty important. In fact, there's one that's missing in that I'll speak to at the end. So incident leader, that's typically going to be your CISO, could be your CIO, depending on the gravity of the incident. You're also going to look for an incident investigator, and again, that's somebody who's deep in the technology and thinking hard about what just happened. Your communications lead. I think everyone can probably think of an angry VP, right? And how, let's say, assertive they get when they want something in particular. The communications lead is responsible for making sure all those extended stakeholders inside the organization are getting the information in a timely fashion, and they're also typically doing double duty in protecting the investigator and doing what they need to do. Lastly, you get into HR, not lastly, rather HR and legal. So the last time you wanted, the least ideal scenario for engaging an internal lawyer is probably in the heat of the battle. So take the time in advance to talk with them, start building those bridges, start bringing them into the fold. Same with HR. And then you get into a little bit about an executive sponsor. Again, the C-suite is already invested in cybersecurity, whether they know it or not, and they definitely will know it when there's a problem. And so enlist them early. The role that I didn't mention in this list is your forensic specialist. Some organizations decide that that's something they want to do internally, and that's that person who, just when the IT prime is about to hit delete, they'll go, well, hang on a minute, don't nuke and pave, think through what we're actually going to do with this information, because we may need it for court. And you don't realize the importance of that until you're actually getting ready to go to court. So a forensics person will be able to help you in that front. Okay. Assets. A lot of conversation happens around boardroom tables, around C-suite level, around executive or not executive, or enterprise risk. So what are the things, if you lost them, would be truly damaging, right? We certainly know funds. Enterprise resource planning would be another one. Financial systems, websites, right? E-commerce websites. Anytime you've got a lot of money going through your websites, you need to think about what would happen if you lost those. And then from that, you can start to build scenarios in your mind as to, okay, well, how do I know if these key assets were actually under attack? What would I do? How would I protect them? And for those of you who are familiar with security incident event management, that starts to get into the discipline of use cases, and we'll talk about that a little bit quickly. Okay. Resources. You can't protect what you can't detect, right? There is a ton of discussion that's happened around being aware, visibility into your network, right? Being able to know when something is actually going sideways. And that's tough, because if you take a look at the amount of log data and so forth, the noise, very difficult to stay on top of all that. And that's back to the too much information can be blinding. And lastly, and this is, I would suggest, fairly common, is that you'll have some very talented individuals in an organization that understand the systems, they understand the environment, and they get to a place where they're looking down a microscope at the log files, right? They'll get an alert or they'll get an incident and they'll look at it and they'll try and piece together a picture. And it's incredibly difficult to do given the level of disparate information they got to try somehow stitch together. So we would suggest to you that when it comes to taking a look at the macro picture, taking a look at the detailed logs, actually going through the process of responding to an incident, where you apply your finite resources is a strategic decision. Because the last thing you want is someone who's distracted by something that's really not that critical. And meanwhile, the stuff that could kill you is going untended. Right? So think through that as we go through. And I guess in terms of the resources itself, you know, our belief running a security operations environment and working with several clients is that a next generation firewall is kind of table stakes these days. Right? It's not good enough just to look at the port traffic. You want to think about the applications that are going through your network. You want to think about who's using them. And you want to think about how much data is going back and forth. That's, we've had a number of client conversations where we show that data, we put a device in the network, and we come back with that data, and it is jaw-dropping, right? Command and control, executables, the like. The stuff that would kind of give you nightmares, right? So having that environment, having that control in place is critical. We also suggest that because of the immense amount of data that goes around and through your network, that you want to take the drudgery of looking at just log files and start to take it up a notch. So back to use cases. You know, and one of the more common ones would be 6 failed login attempts. You know, why would that ever happen? And would your systems actually trigger something, right? Someone's trying to get in. We've seen other use cases where a vice president is swiped in, so they've used their card, their access card, and that you know, based on that information, they're sitting in the office, but they've also VPN'd in from Eastern Europe, right? So that's odd, right? Maybe we should get curious about that one, thinking about that, right? And so you would never, typically, be very difficult to detect card swipe information and correlate that with VPN access. You just typically wouldn't do it, right? Too difficult, too much activity happening. And so a good use case with a good SIM actually gives you that trigger, right? That gives you that alert saying, hey, look here, get curious about this, use the tools to investigate. And then lastly, it's the people, right? If you've got incident responders, go and hug them, take them out for lunch, tell them they're awesome. They're going to save your bacon, right? So we've got do we have our incident responder? Did he leave? Yeah, I think he left. Peter Grierson is, I don't think, in the room anymore. Fantastic guy. He and his team did some wonderful work for us, for TELUS in particular. So, testing the plan. So don't be the world's most interesting man or woman, depending, right? Get in a position where you're in a situation where you can take that plan of record. For those who can't read it, it says, I don't always test my incident response plan, but when I do, it's during an incident, right? So the intent here is that not under the pressure of an actual incident, you're going through and you're looking at what's happening. You've got your team engaged, right? You've thought through who should be doing what by when, and you're taking that, maybe just a paper-based exercise, and you're going through and you're saying, okay, who's on first, right? Who's doing what? Ideally, you're taking it a step further, and you're actually, like the fire drill, moving people around, getting other people, extended stakeholders engaged, so that when the heat of battle comes, you've got a little bit of institutional memory, organizational memory about what you should do. And people have started to imagine what's going to happen. So if you talk to an incident responder, one of the first things that they will talk about typically is emotion, right? What it means, like, again, who was here for Robert Martin's talk? Yeah, so Robert Martin, CISO for Alberta Health Services, he talked about the story of when he got the board through his CIO saying, we had this breach. Is our security team actually on this? Right? Like that gut check moment around, holy smoke. And you start getting fear into the equation. That's a super tough place to to operate with an analytical mind. So helping people figure out how to get there is part of the testing process. IR equals ER. Basically, incident response and emotional response. It is a management of emotions as you go through this. There's some great content on the web, and the yelling, screaming, throwing of chairs. These are some of the stories of the bedraggled and challenged when it comes to incident response. How are you going to deal with that? And the challenge that you're going to have is that will take place. So what we would suggest is that when you actually have an incident, hopefully you've thought about your team. You're hopefully thinking about who's going to be engaged. You get into a place where you've assembled that team, Ideally, think about the place, right? That's one of the subtleties. Again, back to the fire drill. We know that when there's a fire, we're supposed to go to a certain place. We're supposed to congregate at the bottom. We go down the emergency exits. The same thing holds true when you're going through an incident, right? You're gathering, ideally in person, and you're working through the problem. You're getting crisp on who's supposed to do what. You've got an understanding and a plan in terms of how you're going to communicate with your executive, external case stakeholders, and how often you're going to actually get back together again. The other piece that I'd mentioned on this, and these incidents can drag out over a fairly lengthy period of time, is how are you going to handle fatigue, right? How are you going to handle it when somebody is, hour 27, hour 38, you need to pull them back, right? As an incident commander, incident leader, think that through as well. And there's going to be times when you're going to have to make decisions as to who should be out of the room, not just in the room. Sometimes you're going to get too deep into the problem. And that's an important thing to become aware of, is when somebody's just spinning, and giving them a chance to just take a step back and take a breath. Okay. After the incident, there's gold, right? So hopefully everyone's had a chance to take a deep breath, sleep, a beer, something to really just decompress. You want to get that team back together again as quickly as you can to review what happened. In a perfect world, when you're going through these incidents, someone's documenting what's going on. You're probably going to need it for lessons learned, for sure, but you may need it for court as well, for a serious incident. You're going to think about root cause. You're going to think about your debriefing, your communication after the fact, and then you're going to thank your team. Right? Ideally, your executive sponsor is going to be part of that. Again, this is, I think, to make this field more appealing and to help the team understand the importance of what they do. If you can get that executive sponsor at the table, putting their arms around the team that's gone through hell and back to solve the problem, warts and all, that's a huge step forward, right? When you start to celebrate people who have gone to the wall for the organization to recover, regardless of the reason why, I think we're going to start to see incident response become more of a strong discipline within our respective organizations. And I would suggest, too, that there is a cautionary tale that goes along with incident response, and that's blame. So if you talk to incident responders, they'll tell you about the human nature to figuring out what happened is typically to want to assign blame. And while there's a time and a place for that, it's typically not during the incident. And can you guess why? What if the person who made the mistake is the person who's going to help fix it? Right? So do you really want that person on their heels, or perhaps worse, going, I'm out. Now where are you? Right? So again, that comes back to being calm, thinking through what's important about solving the problem, being very focused. You can figure out who did what wrong later. But during the incident itself, put your arms around your team and see if you can't shelter them from all the things that are going to be coming at them so they can work the problem. All right. Second last slide. Incident maturity. And for those of you who can't read this at the back, the hair on fire, I would suggest, is happening a lot, right? It's that phone call that you get, usually, why is Murphy test side is supposed to be 8 o'clock on Friday? Why does that happen, right? But it does. And people trying to react and respond, and again, one of the quotes that, I'm probably going to get this wrong, that Robert talked about is that don't let the incident define you, let your response to the incident define you, right? And if you've spent that little bit of preventative medicine, that time up front, thinking through the scenarios, I think you're going to find that you're going to be far better capable of responding to that situation, which really gets into some of the activities. The planned response, that phase of maturity. These are very quickly, like in the course of a few weeks, you can get up this maturity curve, as long as you have the right endorsement and sponsorship from executive teams and the broader organization. It is a team sport. IR is absolutely a team sport. And then lastly, getting to a place where you've got dedicated team members, right? People that are actually taking training on it, depending, of course, on the number of incidents that you're dealing with. Okay, I'll finish here and to say we're here to help. This is part of our core business, is helping clients sort of assess where they are in terms of their maturity curve, and then come in and give them some ideas as to how to climb it up, or how to basically evolve it. We have a tremendous forensics practice. Very proud of the team that's behind it. Clients bring them in, and these are typically XRCMP members that know how to stand in front of a judge and have that conversation. They know what it means to collect and retain and present evidence. and that's an important discipline. So we'll leave it there. I want to thank you very much. I want to thank the folks, the extended team members, and through also with some of the people in the room who we talked about IR. It's a fascinating subject, and it's something that I think will give us great returns as we get better and better at it. It's good. Thanks. So this is where you get to play along. Thoughts, questions? We need mics to get back to there. Maybe? Fantastic.
Be aware, for those who are interested, has an incident response planning seminar tomorrow.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
So those who didn't hear, there is BC Aware has an incident response planning session tomorrow. So fantastic timing.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's, well, this campaign actually has 15 events. So today is just one. We actually happen to have 17 events within one event, but for the balance of the campaign, there are 15 events, and they're happening. Just go to the website. I won't go through the list, but some of them are happening at higher ed institutions. The government is kind of capping the campaign off with its conference over in Victoria. And on Thursday, Cisco is doing a full-on Cisco Security Day. Some of you might have heard me talk about that earlier, but if you go to the BC Aware website, go to the calendar of events. That one is definitely a must-see. It's, and I know I'm biased, but I happen to work for Cisco. But this is the global security organization from Cisco coming up from San Jose, some of our senior leaders from the security business unit, and we will be mapping out our entire security strategy, how we're bringing an architecture to market. So that's definitely a worthwhile one to circle on your calendar.
Good.
So with that, any other questions, feedback for Conn?
That's good. Yeah, Deb.
Conn, just a comment on the comment that you made about the blame game, because we've all seen that happen, and it's something that happens in a lot of organizations. And one of the things that we've started doing that I think is really making a difference is, particularly when it's something that's a result of human error, which often these situations are, that having the individual that was involved actually put together a presentation and make a presentation back to their peer group of what happened and what they've learned from it, so what the mistake was in the end, because we're finding that the peer group learns more from the individual who's fessing up and saying, I screwed up, but it also demonstrates at a management level that we're supporting people, right? And that we're not going to be ditching people because they make mistakes. We're all human, and that we want to encourage people to stand up and take ownership.
Yeah, you just made an investment in that individual, right? Let's make sure you extract as much learning you can from it. Yeah, right on.
I have a question, a comment you could say, perhaps correctly, but in BC in particular, for probably 5% of the companies that really pay attention to incident response security budgeting. So when it comes to mistakes, in my opinion, very often the issues at management level, because when you go to them with a well-articulated business plan for security, there's always something else that has a higher priority for budgets. So if you look at the Gartner's 2016 CIO priority, it's number 7 on the list, that too, right? Yeah. So in Canada, in my opinion, it's not work, because as a consultant, I see it all the time. And unfortunately, even though this is great, from my experience, very often it takes an incident before we realize the value. Have you seen that? Or
Absolutely. Yeah, we've seen massive organizational change, infrastructure change as a result of an incident. Right? That's I guess it's kind of a little bit about the nature of organizations, is that when the sky falls and they've got the organization has to live, the executive team has to live with the consequences. All of those projects that they said no to suddenly become fascinating, right? And so now I would say cautiously that we are seeing, I think Susie talked about, she's a business person first and then a technologist. So as we get better at articulating the compelling reason why investment in security needs to happen from a business perspective, from a risk perspective, I'm hopeful that CFOs who are already geared to thinking about risk will go, okay, yeah. And do you really want to be the CFO who says no to the control that bites you in the, you know where, 6 months later? Now, of course, that's easy to do with a crystal ball, but there's enough facts and data where I think if we can start pivoting to less bits, bytes, ports, blah, 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 and start thinking about, okay, when our ERP goes down, what would that mean? We have $2 million a month going through our e-commerce site. Fantastic. VP of sales, VP of marketing. What if you lost that for 3 days? How would you like me now? Right? So if we can somehow change the nature of that conversation such that, again, enterprise risk, that's something that every publicly traded organization, every, we'll say, public government organization is already thinking about. So let's just, turn that a little bit to the left and start to thread security risk into that.
I think key is documentation, but very often when you do make recommendations, make sure you have a record that you just say.
Absolutely. Yeah. What's your roadmap? You bet. Good question. Good comments. Anybody else? Any incident responders in the audience that go, hey, you missed the boat on this or that? Like, is there anybody who wants to?
There's one item I would suggest is perhaps CM, because in today's landscape, and perhaps even near future, I don't know if you've seen the RSA report, but we need to go beyond CM. We need to look at more behavior and anomaly-based detection. The next generation firewall is not easily used, but in some ways, really, it has to be game of conception married with analysis based on behavior. CM may not really cut it anymore when it comes to the ability to detect.
So security incident event management platform, that's CM, SIM, however you want to say it. And I think what the gentleman's referring to here is that when you look at user behavior, right, is you take a baseline in how someone is actually behaving on a day-to-day basis. So let's say that they're an engineer, right? And you know that engineer typically goes to this application, they move this kind of data across from here to here, and that's your baseline. Now all of a sudden they start doing something really wonky, right? Your systems hopefully are smart enough to detect that, and again, get your security incident response responders engaged to start investigating. I would agree. It's an evolution.
This is exactly why Cisco went and bought Landcope and paid, I think, $540 million for it, to be able to look at that network traffic and be able to draw that anomalous behavior out. This is what normal looks like. Anything that deviates, beyond a threshold for tolerance that we're okay with, that is anomalous. That creates a security event. Somebody follows up on that. And if we can trace that down to an end user, an end device, even an operating system or a physical location, that's a good thing.
You bet. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Conn. That was awesome.